Christian Zionism is Christians who support Zionism as a political system, who believe that that Zionism has its roots in the scriptures, in the Hebrew scriptures, and that in some sense the creation of the state of Israel is the fulfillment of God's will for the Jewish people, and the best thing the rest of the world can do is see it and accept it and work with it.
I have made it a top priority for my administration to deepen cooperation with Israel across the whole spectrum of security issues: intelligence, military, technology, and in many ways what this legislation does is bring together all the outstanding cooperation that we have seen really at an unprecedented level between our two countries to underscore our unshakable commitment to Israel's security. We are going to be able to announce $70 million in additional spending, $70 billion, excuse me, in additional spending for Iron Dome. This is a program that has been critical in terms of providing security and safety for Israeli families. It is a program that has been tested and has prevented missile strikes inside of Israel.
Many Bible-believing Christians are convinced that God blesses those nations that stand with Israel and curses those that don't. Stephen Sizer, welcome to our program.
Thank you.
This is your book that you wrote about Zion's Christian soldiers. This is one of the books that you wrote. Can you explain to us what is Christian Zionism?
Christian Zionism is Christians who support Zionism as a political system, who believe that that Zionism has its roots in the scriptures, in the Hebrew scriptures, and that in some sense the creation of the state of Israel is the fulfillment of God's will for the Jewish people, and the best thing the rest of the world can do is see it and accept it and work with it.
Can you explain your beliefs? Where did you reach a point of explaining what happened to you in your childhood? Probably you were brought up as a normal Christian?
Yes. As a young Christian in my late teens, early 20s, I visited Israel. I wanted to view the land where Jesus lived. The land of Palestine, the Holy Land, is the fifth gospel. It's the geography, it's the history of the Bible, and I wanted to learn more about my faith. It's like wanting to go to Mecca. You know, you want to go on a Hajj, you want to deepen your faith, and it was very moving. But I discovered that I had inherited a script that viewed the Jews as God's chosen people, and the Palestinians were a problem. They were the Philistines. They were the enemy of God's people, and therefore I was nervous about meeting with them. We avoided them. You know, we went to the holy sites, we took our photographs, we read our Bible, we had our religious experience, and we were just a little frustrated that, you know, the Palestinians were in the way of God's will being realized for the Jewish people. And but I went back a second time and a third time and a fourth time, and every time I went back, a little bit more of that romantic vision dissipated, and I began to get to know Palestinian Christians. I'd been brought up to believe all Palestinians were Muslims. The problem was between the Jews and the Muslims. But to discover a Christian, an indigenous Christian Palestinian community was a revelation. That they'd been there for 2,000 years, that they were suffering as a result of Zionism, and they were suffering largely because the church in the West sided with Israel against the Palestinians. And I began to be troubled by that. And so I did a PhD over about a 10-year period dealing with the historical roots of the Middle East conflict, the role of the church, and discovering the roots of Christian Zionism. You know, most people don't appreciate that there are 10 times more Christian Zionists in the world than there are Jewish Zionists. That Zionism is largely a Christian political viewpoint. It's been birthed, if you like, in Christianity from the 19th century.
It's in your research that you discovered the elements of Zionism, or were they defined somewhere else? I mean, along the way in your after your active life.
Well, if you read most Zionist histories, there's no mention of the role of the church played, or the influence of Christians had on the development of Zionism as a political movement, or its acceptance within Western political circles. But from the 1810s, 1809, you find Christians actively lobbying and encouraging the Jews to go back to Palestine in the belief that this was God's will for the Jewish people and the church. And so long before Herzl came up with his slogan, "A land of no people for a people with no land," Lord Shaftesbury had come up with an expression, a country without a people for a people without a country, 50 years earlier.
Well, let's come back to the modern world and the fact that the Zionist lobbies, as we call them, they have a lot of influence in what happens around the world. Do you agree? And what do you think is the reasons to the events which are happening specifically in the Middle East and maybe in other parts of the world?
Well, the influence of the Zionist lobby really goes back about 100 years. Toward the end of the 19th century, for example, Britain was at war with Germany in the First World War, and it was a kind of a stalemate. Two sides were kind of about equal in terms of power, influence, and both sides looked to the Jews for support against the others. Ironically, 100 years earlier, Wellington and Nelson and the British leadership looked to the Jews to help them defeat Napoleon. Mm-hmm. Napoleon pulled a fast one, and Napoleon was the first world ruler to promise the Jews a homeland in 1799 because he thought the Jews would help him defeat the British. Well, as it turned out, we beat the French. But 100 years later, it was Germany v. Britain, both competing for Jewish support. And Britain did a deal with the Zionist movement that Britain would back Zionist aspirations in Israel if the Zionists could convince the Americans to come into the First World War on the side of the British against the Germans. And that's what happened. So to some extent, British support for Zionism was payback for Zionists helping to lobby and influence the United States to come in on Britain's side in the First World War. So that lobby, if you like, has grown in significance, and the Zionist lobby has been very smart, it has been very strategic, and it has used its resources to influence the media, politicians in particular, to some extent educational circles too, to convince political leaders and general public to warm more to an Israeli perspective or a Zionist perspective than perhaps one that's more evenly balanced in the Middle East.
Do you think this is more basically religious from your research? Did you see more of this religious background which has led to this, let's say, influence and this power, or are there other notions of maybe economy and other things which have ignited this thrust towards the Zionist approach?
Well, it's ironic that Zionism until the 1950s, 1960s was largely secular. It was a political movement that if you go back to the days of the kibbutzes, it came out of Eastern Europe, socialism, collective farms, pioneer movements, parallels with the settlers in North America. But in the 60s particularly, the Zionists figured out that if they were going to galvanize US support for Israel, they needed to play the religious card. And so from the 60s and 70s particularly, the Zionists encouraged the fundamentalists, the evangelicals, the mega churches, if you like, in America to come out to Israel, and they used the scriptures to encourage them to see that this in some sense was the Bible coming true. You have to remember in the 50s and 60s the enemy was Russia, China, communism, and Israel was part of the democratic West, if you like, the bastion in the Middle East, whereas Egypt and Syria were under Soviet influence. Religious Zionism is a much more recent phenomenon. If you look at the settler movement now, it's predominantly or dominated by religious settlers who believe that they are living out their Jewish faith politically, creating facts on the ground.
The excuse for this country named Israel, do you think that came from the events that happened in Europe? Can you give us your take on that? And what have you found in your research?
Well, it is tragic that the suffering of the Jewish people in Europe through the Second World War in particular has led to 50, 60 years of suffering for the Palestinians. That people who were persecuted have turned to become the persecutors of the Palestinians. I think that Europe has tolerated what Israel has done for two reasons. Guilt for the Holocaust and fear of anti-Semitism. On both counts, typically Europeans have been reluctant to criticize Israel for human rights abuses, for war crimes, for apartheid, when we've been quite willing to criticize other nations for its human rights abuses.
You said people are afraid of criticizing. Is this the fact that the West considers itself a cradle of freedom of speech? Do you think that you had the possibility of being free to express your views in Europe?
Well, I have been free and I have expressed my views, but